Hey guys, Cybertile here. This is All Things Chess. Welcome back. We're continuing with our series on isolated pawns. Previous video, we had a brief look at Botvinnik-Vidmar transitioning into symmetry for isolated pawns. We're going to continue with Botvinnik games, but we're going to transition to straight-up kingside assaults. Basically, the logic for the progression through the videos is, once d5 is adequately controlled by black, white has to look for active play beyond pushing the pawn. If the isolated d-pawn isn't able to move, then you have to generate some kingside play to compensate or for the isolated pawn or prevent the isolated pawn from being attacked in the first place. One such great game was Botvinnik-Vidmar, Nottingham, 1936. The two games I'm going to do, this first one, it has a sort of a unique structure. It's not necessarily seen a lot anymore, but it's still an important idea to take on board. But we'll get to it when we see it. But the first move of the game is c4. The English opening, it's sort of a transpositional jungle. It can turn into a lot of different openings. So if you're an experienced player looking to trick a less experienced player, it's a pretty useful move to have on board. E6, f3, d5. And here we've just gone right into a queen's gambit declined. G3 is the main part of my repertoire. It's just a main line ready. Interesting bit of trivia about the move order. Back in the day, it was thought that, and I'll just put the main line on the board, it was thought that the Albin counter gambit here with e5 was strong for black, or at least complicated, so it was important for white to have a move order to avoid that. That would be, for instance, one that we saw in the game. This seems sort of strange to modern ears, because the Albin counter gambit is more or less just worked out to a better position for white. You know, it's still interesting, it has some complexities, but no one on the white side of the board is really afraid of it. But back then, they did choose move orders to avoid the Albin counter gambit, which is sort of hilarious now, but chess is funny sometimes. So d4, knight f6, bishop g5, we just go to a main line, queen's gambit declined here. Bishop d3. This position here, it's sort of the beginning of the whole queen's gambit decline complex. There's several different moves here. It's a whole transpositional jungle. You can switch back and forth between different lines, just based on various subtleties. Bishop d3 is the move I like the least. It's the most direct, and it's still perfectly fine for white. The move I like the most would be queen c2. Basically, in this position, there's what's called the battle of the tempo. Any move from the white bishop should be met with dxc4. So a lot of times white will try to hold off on moving that light square bishop to avoid losing that tempo. It's called the battle of the tempo. Queen c2 would be my favorite way to continue fighting for that tempo. The only downside is that if the c file becomes open, the white queen potentially might have to move and waste another tempo down the road. That is a possibility. Another choice that's popular is rook c1. Keeps the queen on the home square and keeps her off the c-file in case the c-file opens up. The downside is the c-file might stay closed, and in that situation, the rook on the c-file would be completely useless, or at least half useless. Queen c2 would be my personal choice, just because I think it's the strongest and it scores the best from this position. Bishop d3 is the one I like the least, just because it immediately loses that tempo. Vidmar doesn't gain the tempo, though. He plays c5, which I personally don't really care for. The main reason you don't see bishop d3 played anymore is d takes, bishop x c4, and a6. And this is sort of a supercharged semi-Slav here for black. Usually black has to play c6 and a6 before he achieves b5 or threatens b5. But here, black is threatening b5 in one go without having to waste a tempo on c6. So if white wants to stop, if white doesn't stop b5, black is just perfectly fine. He's going to play b5. Let me just put some moves on the board real quick. b5, bishop b7, and then c5 comes the next move. And black is, at the very least, equal. Might even be a little bit better. If white decides to stop b5 with a4, just c5, and we get into an isolated queen-pawn complex, except white has a very weak b4 square. He can't play a3 anymore to kick anything out of the b4 square. And that matters. As we saw in our previous videos, a lot of times white will try to build that queen and bishop battery. He'll try to put a bishop on c2 and a queen on d3. Without a3, a knight on b4 can break that battery up at any point. And by playing a4 so early, he forfeits the opportunity to ward that battery off. So, not personally, c5 is, in my opinion, not a great move. He absolutely should have taken on c4. That guarantees black at least an equal game. But c5 was played. Botvinnik castled. He's really looking to get that isolated queen pawn. He could have just taken knight x. And this is one example. And white has a very pleasant position here. Neither side has pawn weakness, but white has an edge mobilization. Black's light square bishop is still quite poor. And white has some obvious moves to continue. He can play queen e2, bring his rooks to the c and d file. And white's very comfortable. But Botvinnik, when he was a younger player, made a very thorough study of isolated queen pawns, so as much as possible, he stayed within the isolated queen pawn structures. So here, he wasn't happy to try to get an isolated queen pawn. He wanted to get the isolated queen pawn for himself, which he does with castles. So Vidmar takes on d4, bishop takes, and now we have the basic isolated pawn structure. Major difference compared to the games we've previously looked at. In the two previous videos, the knight was on c6, and in here it's on b6. The major difference is that means the square d5 is completely under black's control. Now, that is a positive. There is a negative to the knight being on b6, though, is that the e5 square isn't challenged for at all. That is a concrete downside, because typically a white knight tends to go to e5 fairly regularly. So black has no influence over that square, so he can't trade that strong knight on e5 off if he needs to. Now, control of d5 is a positive, but that's only black's first step. He also has to develop counterplay and pressure against the weak d4 pawn, or try to nullify white's kingside play. Just owning the pretty d5 square isn't enough. He has to develop positive play for himself. And the problem for black in this game is that he never develops that positive play. He just sort of sits on the d5 square and watches his game get absolutely wrecked. Bishop d7, fairly good choice. The notes have some slightly superior move order, but I don't want to go over everything in the video and make things too long. Queen d3, knight e5 is another good choice, but queen d3, perfectly normal IQP move. Knight b d5. This is a clear one of the first clear mistakes of the game. And this is sort of what I was talking about earlier with black needing to develop play for himself. Knight b d5, it's a correct, pretty-looking move. It brings the knight where it's supposed to go on the d5 square, but it doesn't actually threaten anything. It doesn't force white to respond to anything. So white is just able to continue to develop his own play on the king side. The correct move would have been knight f to d5, because this actually carries a threat. Black's actually looking to trade some pieces off the board so he can get closer to a more favorable endgame. In this position, white should probably drop back to d2. If he starts trading minor pieces off, typically once that happens, black is perfectly fine, and that's no exception here. But on bishop d2, knight b4, queen e4, the white queen gets kicked around a little bit, and suddenly after a5, black actually has a decent little queenside initiative. He can throw that pawn as far up the board as he can. He can go to a4 and possibly even a3. But at the very least on a4, it kicks that strong light square bishop away and takes the initiative away from white. So, at least in this position, black is developing his own play. He's not just sitting on the d5 square and waiting for something to happen. Whereas with the move played in the game, this doesn't carry a threat. So white's just able to continue to develop his own play. So knight e5, that's where the knight belongs. Bishop c6. Rook a d1. Queen h3 was probably a slightly different, slightly more effective move order, because in some lines rook a d1 can be saved as a move, but that's a small quibble. Knight b4. This is another move that looks pretty, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything. Add to that, it forces white to make a move he wanted to make. White wanted to play queen h3. And knight b4, wouldn't you know, forces queen h3. You don't want to be forcing your opponent to make moves that he wants to make to begin with. Knight b4 is Also, it's moving a piece away from the critical king side. Black doesn't want to be moving pieces away from the king side. He wants to be moving pieces close to the king side, or creating his own counter threats. Instead of knight b4, knight d7 was critical. He needs to start attacking some white pieces and getting white pieces off the board. Just one example of how black can be perfectly fine here. Bishop c2, g6, then rook e8. And black is perfectly fine here so far. The black king side isn't so weakened that white can necessarily take advantage of it, and that black knight on d5 really adds to black's stability. Also, notice the bishop on c6 is actually quite a decent piece here. But this is perfectly fine for black. If white starts to trade things off, black's also quite happy. This is probably white's best from knight d7. This could be a little bit of an edge for whites, because eventually it's probably going to go to... these two knights will get traded off the board, and then it'll be a knight versus a bad bishop. That's a little bit of something, but it shouldn't be so much that black needs to be afraid. It should still be well within the drawing range for black. But yeah, knight b4 is just completely wrong. So queen h3, that's where the queen wanted to go anyways, and now it's aiming... Look at the bishop on b3. It's aiming at that weak e6 pawn, and also at the kings on the same diagonal. If only there were a way to clear away the e6 pawn. That's foreshadowing. So bishop d5, knight takes, knight bd5. Again, the knight looks pretty, but this move doesn't carry a threat, so white doesn't need to respond. It was critical for black to take with the f knights, because this at least comes with a threat, and it stops white from just endlessly teeing up. So now, white doesn't want to be trading pieces, so he doesn't want to take an e7. He should probably drop back. Queen d6, rook a d8. And this is where I stop, because it's just sort of a more open-ended position. This is still better for white. You know, white's got the bishop pair, and he's got good attacking chances. But this is nothing like the game. This is much more of a contest than the game ended up being. Black could easily still be in this game with proper play. But after knight bd5, the b knight taking a d5, there are no threats. White's just completely free to choose whatever plan he'd like, because there's no pressure on white's position. So, as I say with virtually every video, whenever you're looking for a plan, it's vital to look at the pawn breaks. And pawn breaks are when you bring two pawns, your own pawn up against an enemy pawn where it can be captured, where it could potentially open up a line. So, right here, there are no immediate pawn breaks, but there's one pawn break that white could prepare, and that's the move he made. He plays f4. And this is preparing the only pawn break left on the board. It's preparing f5. And that's a vital move here, because the e6 pawn is sort of the linchpin of black's stability. It supports the pawn on d5, or the knight on d5. It keeps the diagonal from a2 to g8 completely plugged up. If the e6 pawn were to be gone, the knight on d5 would be much more fragile, and the king on g8 would be much more fragile, because the bishop would be one pawn closer to getting right to him. So f4 is absolutely the correct move. If he achieves f5, which he will, it unleashes all the activity from white's position. When you're trying to plan, this is so critical, look at the pawn breaks. Look where you can bring your pawn into contact with an enemy pawn to open lines up and open up energy for your pieces. And that's exactly what Botvinnik does for here. Young Botvinnik was absolutely relentless in pursuing plans and pawn breaks. Looking over the games of young Botvinnik is just... It's like watching a bulldozer roll over a watermelon. It's relentless. It's quite the metaphor. So rook c8, there are a couple more options. Rook c8 is a fairly compliant move. Just note, I give the analysis in the notes, but note that g6 doesn't actually stop f5. So if black plays rook e8 here, just f5. It just shatters right through. And then rook takes. White's got basically all of his pieces mobilized. Now is the time to open things up. When your pieces are perfectly placed, that's when you need to start thinking about moves like this, because it opens position up to your benefit. G takes. And look at this position for yourself, but there's absolutely no defense to White's threats. White's just threatening Queen G5 with mate and 2, and there's no way to stop any of these threats. Have a look at the position yourself, but this is just completely gone for Black. So Rook C8, it's a compliant move, but overall, Black's just busted to begin with, because White's got all the play. Black never developed any positive play for himself. He just had sort of a nice-looking position. So F5, going ahead with a planned pawn break. EF, Rook X F5, Queen D6, Knight X F7. And this is just a completely logical sacrifice. It just concentrates on opening up that light square diagonal to the king. All of White's pieces are perfectly placed. When your pieces are perfectly placed, that's when you want to relentlessly open the position up to the king. And that includes looking for sacrifices like these. Look at your pawn breaks, and look at ways to open up ways to the enemy king. When you look at that bishop on b3, opening up its field of fire is most certainly worth a piece, but here the sacrifice is only temporary, because there's so much material on that diagonal that White gets his investment back immediately. Rook X F7, then just bishop takes, and then this is very simple chess. Bishop takes. If the knight takes back, you can just play rook takes. And notice the queen is going to take on c8 in the next move. But bishop takes, rook x, rook d6, and just chasing the queen away from the defense of the rook on c8. And then exploiting the pin on the rook on f7. And Vidmar went ahead and resigned here. Really, the key to this game was the opening, as usual. This was these positions back here. This was really the key to the game, especially this move here. This was Black's real opportunity to generate some real play for himself. It's not enough to have a nice-looking position. The move he played, Knight BD5, it gave him a nice-looking position. He got to sit on the D5 square, but it didn't carry any threats. You can't just sit in place without any counterplay and wait to be attacked, because typically the attack's just going to break through. You need to develop play for yourself to stop your opponent from just endlessly teeing up on you. If you have no counterplay, you are going to lose. So this choice here, Knight FD5, that would have developed counterplay, but then Black had a couple other choices as well. So instead of Knight B4 here, he could have tried to trade some White's attacking force off the board. Once he missed those two chances, and he even had a third chance here. Taking back with the F-Knight at least carries a threat. It forces White to respond. But again, he played the passive move, the pretty-looking move, and it just allowed White to just completely bulldoze things open. So, aside from the lesson isolated pawn, which is F4, F5 is a consequential break sometimes, always be looking for ways to generate your own play. If you don't generate your own play, your opponent's going to absolutely run over you. And this game is a perfect example of this. So, the PGN will be in the notes as usual. We're going to continue the series with another example from Botvinnik's games. I should have that uploaded later tonight. Otherwise, my name is Salvertile, and I will see you later.